the unanswered questions from today's webinar. We received around 30 questions. What I'm going to do is try and answer each one as informatively as possible, but at the same time keep it concise. Why did you avoid the use of the terms positive and negative emotions? What is the danger of this? Well, the idea of positive emotions assumes that getting in one emotional state is going to be positive, and that goes against what Baumeister and the evolutionary psychologists talk about, that all emotions have a function, and the idea that that all emotions have a function suggests that there will be situations where that function is helpful for someone. So we could look at anxiety, which typically one which is associated with being negative, although we know there's a massive research which suggests that people feel that it can be quite positive. What does anxiety do? It tells you that there's something in your environment which is warning, something is a threat. It raises your awareness. It has a physiological response which gets you ready for a fight or flight response. It's preparing you for that, and so it's got a function. And when the situational factors trigger that emotional response, that function may help you survive. In that case, it's positive. The danger, if there is a danger, and this I would suggest you read Chris Beady's chapter in the Eros book, which talks about the number of self-help books which take a hedonistic approach to emotion regulation. The idea that we should be always thinking to drive up our pleasant emotions and drive down our unpleasant emotions, and this is the desirable state, when in fact there may be a really good reason why you're feeling in an unpleasant emotional state, and searching for the cause of that reason may be a really useful exercise in gaining some inner knowledge of what is going on inside your mind as to what your motivations are. So from that sense, from the sense that all emotions have a function, because that is how they have survived evolution, suggests that terming them positive and negative can be slightly misleading. The hedonistic model of emotion regulation in the research almost suggests that negative emotions are negative in terms of their consequences and therefore should be avoided, and we know lots and lots of research which says that's not the case. So it's from those reasons why we avoided using them. We've provided a really nice answer to that in a paper in the Scandinavian Journal of Sports Science and Medicine, of which I will put on that slide. What is the difference between emotion and mood regulation? Good question. An emotion has a specific factor that the individual is aware of that is causing the intense affective state. So you know why you feel in a certain way, whereas mood, you're uncertain of the reason as to how you're feeling. So when you then start to try and regulate those feelings with the emotion, you can try and reappraise the cause of those feelings because you've identified it. Whereas with mood, you're unaware of that, and therefore the target of the reason why you're feeling in that way is more unclear. So a reappraisal of a certain fact would work for an emotion, whereas something like going for exercise, changing what you're doing, might work as a mood regulation. Which is the best way to address heightened anxiety and self-doubt about performance in an individual? Okay, there are many ways to address anxiety. One of those ways is about reappraising the situation, trying to see the situation differently, and trying to see yourself differently in that situation. Typically in sport, we give athletes interventions, techniques such as imagery, such as self-talk, which are all about changing their perception of themselves so that they are more capable of performing successfully. Self-talk about it can break down the task so that you know which components of the performance are going to make it difficult to do really well, and talk yourself into a belief that you're very good at those. Imagery can be about seeing yourself perform and getting an idea that you can handle the demands of the task as successfully as you need to in order to achieve your performance goals. It's always important to keep that self-talk and imagery realistic. Another way of doing that is to try to reappraise what the anxiety is all about. The idea that anxiety and self-doubt have to come together is not necessarily the case. Anxiety is likely to come is likely to be experienced in an individual when they take part in any performance that is really important to themselves, and the anxiety may be signalling to that person, this is important, and because it's important, you're now feeling anxious, and what that's telling you is about getting yourself ready to take part. So you could see the anxiety as ready to take part. You could see that anxiety as something that comes with performance, and a bit like getting fatigue comes when you've run for 2 hours. You expect it, it's part of the deal that comes with it, and what you've got to do is get on with how you perform with that fatigue. So you welcome the anxiety in as something that is part of the experience, and so actually you're telling me I need to think very carefully about what I need to do. So it's about reinterpreting the anxiety. It doesn't always have to be so negative.
Okay, Chris, we've got your data from best and worst performance, and looking at the anxiety scores, it's not a lot of difference between best and worst performance. You're quite anxious before your best and just a little bit higher in anxiety before your worst. Can you sort of give us a bit more detail as to what's going on between those two performances?
Yes, a lot. So I'm aware of the bodily changes that are going on, that my heart rate might be a bit higher, but normally the negative performance is associated with their negative thoughts rather than actually the sensations.
The thing is about emotions that they can be very intense irrespective of your level of competition. I know lots of people who take part in what might be fun runs feel awfully nervous before taking part and are really uncertain about how to go about changing these emotions or trying to learn to reinterpret them. So it's not only about trying to have strategies available, but also have the confidence to use them at the critical times.
Can you explain how to support emotion regulation of youth athletes, for example, a 14-year-old during competition? Okay, good question. First is that 14-year-olds are going through potentially difficult times, and it's they're likely to be experiencing some sort of pressure from school, where they are usually or typically in full-time education, and the idea that they need to get academic qualifications could be a driving force behind them, and it's not unusual for them to have goals to do quite well in those areas. They are maturing into an adult, and there'll be social goals of boyfriends, girlfriends that start coming into play. There'll be friends starting to be more adventurous in their social activities, and those will create goals for them to go out on different evenings and so on. I think what you're alluding to, the idea is that someone gets really emotional during competition and struggles to keep that in check. If that's the case, we'll just explore that for the moment. And that they're 14 is interesting, but it's not necessarily something to change all your principles about. Because what you want to know is what are the triggers for that what are the triggers for those emotions. So you'd get that by talking to the individual for them to go through, why they became angry or why they became so excited, why, and how intense those feelings were, why they think they came about, and what was the what were the reasons behind that. Following that is how they might try to manage those emotions, whether they try to squash them down, or whether those emotions would drive them on to doing some sort of behaviours that they later regretted, but behind them with the driving force of the emotions, and certainly usually after acting in an angry way. That's the end of the anger, and so the outrageous behaviour has sought to control the anger, albeit we've got a new emotion of now feeling guilty for all the abuse we did whilst being angry. And it's funny that when you are angry it feels so righteous to behave in that way. So you explore what the person does, and from that, following that, is the following that is then the strategies that people could start to use in order to control those emotions. And one of the things I think is a really effective way to do that is using the if-then planning strategies. The idea that the if part is that if I get a sense that there was an unfair decision, and it's unfair decisions that get me extremely emotional, then I will, and then when you put the solution is, then I'll say to myself, and then the person needs to be coached through a way of saying something to themselves which will actually disrupt them from the angry episode or the outburst. And that might be, then I'll say to myself that getting angry is likely to lead to me sending off, and sending off is likely to make me feel guilty, or something that you could then work with a coach, another player, with the athlete themselves, which then becomes something really personal to them, and helps talk them out of the intense emotional state that they're experiencing. I've read Steve Peters' book, and I think it's really interesting, and I think it's slightly misinterpreted in some ways, because it's really about controlling emotions, and the difficulty it is to control emotions. That's important, and the idea that you don't want your emotions to control you is pretty much key to what's being said. So you really want to be the driver of what you do, rather than be reactive to an emotional outburst. And we know that emotions come flooding in, and we don't want those the drivers of what we're doing. So it's around that idea of reappraising situations, so you're in control, is where I think where that one's going, rather than emotions not being relevant, in the sense that they are can be quite useful. Although in the book Steve Peters does talk that emotions are quite useful. It's just very difficult to control. How do you balance emotional composure with maximum effort? I've had struggles with this with tennis players. The key here for me is about the ability to teach people how to change their emotional arousal, and to be aware of the effects of emotional arousal on performance at different levels. So what I would do with this group of people, or this any individual, is look at strategies to change their emotional arousal, so when they can increase and when they can decrease their arousal levels, and give them a whole set of techniques to be able to do that. And they may well be performance related, the idea of using self-talk to increase your arousal, or the idea of some kind of physical strategy to reduce your level of arousal. Breathing techniques are often used to bring arousal levels down. But it's about exploring the effects of emotional arousal on different levels of performance, and then building practices to be able to change those levels of arousal in training, so that once you've got to competition, you've got well rehearsed strategies to use when similar situations appear.
Okay, one of the things about deciding to try and intervene yourself and change your emotions is knowing when to do this. So Chris, when you've been feeling nervous before a competition, have you
Are we placing too much emphasis on anxiety when examining emotions? Is it the combinations of emotions that's most important? And that's an interesting question, and from a researcher's point of view, I would agree completely. It's the combination of emotions, and what we find is when we look at research that is looking at emotion and performance relationship, it is those combinations. It is anxiety on its own is very difficult to interpret, but anxiety that's experienced alongside depression tends to be a very different experience to anxiety that's experienced alongside feeling energetic or excited. We know that people experience a combination of emotions. In the early years of doing my research, when my children were very small, I'd ask them how they felt on Christmas Eve, and they would say, I feel a bit nervous, and probably because they knew the sort of presents I'd bought them were rubbish, but they said they felt very nervous, and they also felt very excited because it's Christmas Eve. But the words that they used were nervous, and in other parts of my work where people are telling me how they're feeling, anxiety is often reported, or language, words that academics would describe as anxiety are often reported, and therefore it's not necessarily my emphasis that is being reported here, but more a response to what I'm receiving from when I speak with people about their emotions prior to competition and during competition. And it's the intense ones that get noticed, and we talked about emotions at the start, and that they tend to feel good or bad, and they're certainly that when they're intense you notice them, and anxiety is an emotion that is very intense and one that you do notice. When you're very happy, you tend not to notice so much that you're very happy. It's later when you think back to when you're not happy you realise that you were happy at the time. But I agree from a researcher's point of view and a practitioner's point of view, it's important to know the combinations of emotions. I'm not always sure from the athlete's point of view to have all that information coming launched back at them is so important. And people often talk about anxiety being the key one that they want to try and alter, and the idea that they feel excited and anxious at the same time in their way can often mean that they're no longer anxious by just how they were defining anxiety. A very long answer to your question. I could answer it very, very briefly. If it was all about research, I'd say examine a number of emotions, because this gives you the information that you need. The key finding from the research is that taking part in the interventions led to improved performance and improved emotional control. What results did you find with the control group runners who completed the Test of Performance Strategies questionnaire, and were their findings significant? Well, all the runners in that study completed the Test of Performance Strategies questionnaire before taking part, as an idea to how frequently they use psychological skills in their training before we offered them self-help interventions. And there are no differences between any of the conditions, including the self-regulatory condition which acted as the control group in that instance. The control group were found to increase the amount of psychological skills they were using, and that's perfectly logical because we prompted them to. They showed a reduction in unpleasant emotions, an increase in pleasant emotions, and a significant change in performance. In fact, they were no different to the other interventions that were used in the study. We largely think that was because they had their own self-regulation strategies. And when you look at the study which Damien Stanley led on the strategies that runners use on their own, which was a qualitative investigation, you can see that they had an array of different strategies. Some were quite close to what you might commonly call psychological strategies used by sports psychologists, and certainly many of them tapped into the similar types of processes. They were cognitive or behavioural in their approach. So it's not too surprising that you encourage people to do more of something. You say that it's likely to work, which is in the context of the study, how it's set up, that people start believing in it a bit more often, which is one of the main findings, and as a consequence you get a significant effect. Some studies conducted on negative effects of fatigue on physical performance showed that fatigued people in those studies reported higher levels of anger. Can those findings suggest that anger has a negative effect on physical performance? Of course, it's possible to interpret the studies in that way, and in one of our studies we found that as people got progressively more fatigued, they also became more angry. And what you can get in some cases is this general increase in all the unpleasant emotional states going in the same direction. So as they get more fatigued, they get more angry, they also start feeling a little bit down, and that might well be because they're really finding it a struggle to cope with the demands of the task. So you've got this collective unpleasant emotional state which is signalling to the individual it's difficult. It's really difficult to meet the physical demands of performance. All I'd say to that finding is to separate those type of studies from ones where you can see anger as a specific reaction to something, and when it's a specific reaction to something, it might well be a trigger to be quite motivational, or might also be a trigger to behave quite badly. But it's important to separate anger anger when it's an intense spike unrelated to other emotions than when it's part of a collective emotional state. That's, I think, is a key point there.
One of our projects we're running at the moment is run in conjunction with the BBC. It's fronted by Olympian Michael Johnson. What the project involves is completing a number of questionnaires, then performing in a number of tests. At the end of it, you get a report on your psychological strengths and weaknesses and how well you've done in the test. What Michael does, he talks you through how you can improve your mental game.
Why do you think the level of fatigue between best and worst performance is so similar? When someone rates their best performance, it's possible that that came when they were working extremely hard and they felt extremely fatigued during that performance. And therefore, it's not too surprising that when someone's asked to recall how they felt during that best performance, then they're going to report a relatively high score for that emotional state. We have found that in a number of studies that use endurance performance, and certainly from the work I've done with endurance athletes, they often associate best performance with feeling extremely fatigued. So that's a fatigue at the end of performance, and that fatigue is associated with emptying the tank, as it were, in terms of the amount of effort you've given. The important role of beliefs in emotion regulation suggests that hope might be an important emotional state. Has there been much research into hope as a performance-enhancing emotion? Well, there hasn't really, and it's the whole concept of hope and its relationship with beliefs, and the idea that hope might be a really powerful state to be in when things are not going so well, because you won't give up as so easily, and the idea that you'll keep pursuing just as intensely because you have got some hope, some idea that you might actually achieve what you want to achieve. So I think there's lots of work to be done there, and it's something that our group are actually doing. So we will hope to report on that question sometime in the future. On the role of biofeedback tools and their role in creating a physiologically stable base upon which emotional states can be more readily chosen. Interesting question. We've done quite a lot of work with looking at the sort of physiology of emotions and the neurophysiology of emotions. I'm a great fan of using such measures to try and underpin what's going on away from self-report, if you like. So I would say that they are very useful, because what can be going on consciously is detecting one level of affective responses, and we can look at physiological responses as to what's going on in non-consciously, or what is not going to be admitted consciously. And sometimes when you're talking through someone's physiological response and that doesn't quite tally up with their self-report can change quite quickly, suggesting that the self-report in itself may well be acting as a self-regulatory strategy, in the idea that telling someone else is actually telling yourself that you're feeling different to what you actually are, typically better than what you are. You're presenting an emotional state as a sort of public picture of yourself. So I think there's a lot of value in it. Looking at the data, it seems personality might have determined interpretations of the same emotion, as well as personality differences in the ability to recognise and manipulate emotions. Any thoughts on the role of personality differences as an influence upon the impacts of emotion on the performance? Of course, there's been quite a bit of research looking at the relationship between personality and emotional states, the idea that stable extroverts tend to experience higher scores of, say, vigour and lower scores of more of the unpleasant emotional states. The idea that emotional stability should predict less variation in emotions. We know from results which has looked at emotion regulation personality scales, such as Gross's measure, which Mark Jones and Mark Uphill and I validated for use in sport, and looking at that, looking at the relationships between emotional states experienced in competition, in that reappraisers tend to experience more pleasant emotional states, and they tend to have more positive interpretations of supposedly unpleasant emotional states. We know that people who suppress emotions tend to struggle to reappraise those unpleasant emotions as being fairly effective on performance. So all of that is getting towards what you're talking about in that question, the idea that there are underlying personality characteristics which have got an influence on the emotional responses of different situations. Obviously, it's very difficult to control for situational factors, so we always get a bit of variation. We lose a lot of prediction in performance and prediction in relationships as a consequence in our studies, to have a real confidence in some of those relationships that we see in studies. But I think I agree largely with your point. I think personality is a large point to play, and I think from a practitioner's point of view, identifying the people who are likely to experience great variation in their emotions and have trouble in reappraising unpleasant emotions as being functional, tend to be a certain personality type, tend to have repeats of that. They're not one-off. Do you have any data of perceived exertion on study of feedbacks? We use perceived exertion in the pilot studies. We didn't use it in the final studies because we weren't getting a lot of variation in perceived exertion. For the majority of the cycles, time trials, the athletes were pretty much near the top, and because it's a continuous effort, it just hurts, and they'd get near the top and you get a very small variation. It was an additional question to be asked, and the riders were already completing quite a lot of questionnaires ongoing, so it wasn't used. I am not a great fan of perceived exertion either, particularly when you're measuring perceived fatigue as well, and one can be mapping over the other. The perceived exertion comes with its own literature, and we kind of steered clear of that. Terry 1992 figure. What do you think causes the huge difference between athlete A and athlete B? I think there are a number of factors that are going on here. I think that personality is a big factor, and that certain people become anxious more easily than others, and as a consequence of becoming anxious more easily, they are more likely to have performed very well when experiencing high anxiety. And in certain sports, you can perform very successfully, you can win competitions almost irrespective of the emotional state. Two people both in very unpleasant emotional states, one of them will win, and we know that to be the case because it has to happen. Then there's the effect of experience and learning that's going to occur, and the idea that when someone experiences high anxiety and performs very successfully, then that's created a link between anxiety and performance. The next time that they perform, if they remember how anxious they felt and they start attributing the anxiety to performance in a positive way, then they start getting they start to develop a strong belief that feeling that way links to performance, and so it may well be an experience factor that's explaining the results. In terms of the interactional model by Serin, yes, that's possible to provide an explanation. I would rather think that the work of Baumeister et al. In the 2007 paper, which talks about the idea that emotion provides learning rules, is a pretty strong one to explain that result. And I think that Baumeister's work in sport captures Hannin's work also. So that would probably be my preferred. Do you have any research on coaching emotional control in young people? Tracy Devonport and I have recently had a paper accepted which developed an intervention which gave adolescent athletes coping packs, and one of those coping packs was about emotional intelligence. The idea of that work was to look at the sort of transferability of psychological skills, that if you're good at goal setting in an academic sense, would that transfer to a sporting sense, or you're good at setting goals in sport, would it transfer to academia? There's some really nice work from Tom Webber at Sheffield, which said it's not about increasing the amount of coping skills you're using, or the emotion regulation strategies you're using. There's a bit of a blur in what counts as an emotion regulation strategy, which is a coping strategy. It's not about the amount you use, it's about using it effectively at the right time. And what we found in that study was something very similar. It's the transfer of skills from one situation to the other was all about recognizing the likely stressors stresses about to come, and implementing an intervention really early. So the idea that prevention is better than cure, something that applies. Are there any investigations on team sports, and should the same psychological techniques be used on team sports as well? Interesting one. Peter Totterdell in 2001 did a lovely study on emotion regulation in cricket, and Peter Totterdell in 2000 looked at the transfer of emotions, the idea of emotional contagion in team sports, and all those ideas make sense in the idea that you've got one athlete who's very anxious sitting next to another athlete who's not very anxious but in the same situation. The idea that one athlete conveys that message over to someone else. And within our EROS project, we looked at the transfer of emotions from one person to the other, and the idea that if one person's very anxious, another person who is quite close to them may well pick their emotions up as well. We've been doing research with a group in France, and those articles are being written at the moment, so it's a bit early in the process to start talking about that work as being in the literature. But there's certainly the idea that people might want to experience unpleasant emotions in the short term if it generates successful performance in the long term. Andrew Friesen wrote a really nice chapter in the EROS book which talks about that in team settings.
So I work with an adult football team. I've witnessed negative emotions spread throughout the team during matches. How can I prevent this from happening? Well, one is the idea that witnessing unpleasant emotions may well be fatiguing for the person who watches them. And the other part to that is that it occurs late in a game when the person may be physically fatigued as a consequence of doing all that running about, and the idea that of course that makes perfect sense. So you've got intense emotions creeping up on a team or being suddenly activated when they're fatigued. How do you prevent that? Well, firstly, I think is to make them aware that it's occurring, and the idea that there is a tendency to have intense emotional invasions late on during the game, and what are the consequences of this, and to make people aware that there may be unwanted consequences of this. So If people want to stop it from happening, being made conscious that it is happening to begin with is a good starting point, because that will start triggering self-regulatory process to say, actually, I don't really want this to happen. What shall I do about it as an individual? And that might well be start reappraising certain situations that differently. So I'm aware that last time I got very angry, and talk yourself out of a sequence of events that might trigger intense anger the next time it goes on. So you're teaching people ways to think themselves out of a process that gets them into a very angry state and a somewhat uncontrolled state, I think, is what we might be leading to on this. If we take a second line, if emotion regulation has a physical consequence, and we've played around with that through the work of looking at Baumeister's work and our own work, then another way of doing that is try and replenish resources earlier on in the game, and the idea that some taking on carbohydrate drinks during half time may well have a benefit in terms of endurance performance, but it may well have a benefit in terms of helping maintain self-control. The last part is a little bit speculative from my part, but it's not different to one of the experiments that Galileo demonstrated in that drinking lemonade, i.e. a sugar drink, helped self-control. And if that was the case, applying that to this, that would certainly make sense. Is there any information on how to teach emotion regulation to child athletes? Small children were not the focus of our project, and I have to admit I haven't done any work with very small children other than the fact that I'm a parent, but you can't rely on that. In our project, Pasco Fearon from the University of Reading did a whole load of research in this area, and the best thing I can do is refer you to his work, which can be found in Should I Strap a Battery to My Head?
Can you define the role of the applied practitioner working across sports at different levels, junior, academy, senior professional and elite, and explain how practitioners attend to the cultural and contextual features associated with these aspects? What a complicated question, and we've got lots of layers that want addressing in order to provide a full answer to that. The practitioner has a role to the care of the people who they're working with, and that, in my view, that's central. And so the role is looking at the well-being of the individuals. As a psychologist, I think the self-esteem is really important. I think there's lots of challenges for sports psychologists working in a performance-driven environment to maintain or help maintain an individual, but develop a robust self-esteem that will make it strong to the potentially damaging aspects of win-loss that comes with how they go in performance, and particularly losing, obviously, and also for how they can be a rounded person, for want of a better term. But the idea that your self-esteem is not only situated in sport, but in a number of different aspects of your life, and the ability to be able to switch that self-esteem to different aspects is really important. And I guess that's where cultural factors come into it, and having an understanding of how that may affect certain individuals. But within that, it's really important not to assume that just because someone is in one situation and that situation has a strong culture, that individual is a strong believer of some of the values that are coming out from that culture. I mean, my view on this, and taking emotion regulation and emotions as the topic of investigation, is that you really should drive down the individual approach. The work of Yuri Hanin has been particularly useful in this, and it's worked across different countries and arguably across different cultures. And that approach of identifying what an individual thinks in terms of how they're thinking, feeling, what's best for them, and then working on a solution that is tailored around that belief and the assessment that comes with it, certainly captures some of the things I was talking about, and certainly would attend to the idea that you are not going to You're not going to put your dominant views from your culture over the top of theirs. I'm not sure that's the best answer to it, but I'm not sure that in the time we've got available that I could ever give a very, very good answer to that question, because it is it's got so many different
It's a two-way process. There's some more references to look at if you want to follow up any of this work. Final big thank you to Human Kinetics and Basis for allowing us to do this, and that's the date of the next presentation. Thank you very much.